young people have been misled about generally everything, and I think this is because of a progressive education system that can't bear to tell the truth about almost anything. And this begins in the earliest years of their lives, and it goes through the entire gamut of what people know. I mean, what a man or a woman is, the dynamics between men and women as they become teenagers, what is expected of them by society at large, the very nature of gender roles, the very nature of the country itself, what their futures might well look like, the kind of jobs they should be going for.
Yeah, I want to unpack something you said, because I think it's incredibly important.
Sure.
A progressive education system. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's still an ideology.
Yes.
Right? So It's no longer about, as the psychologist Jonathan Haidt says, it's no longer about truth, helping people find truth. It's about pushing and forwarding a very specific ideology.
Yes. I mean, the way I look at it is kind of like the difference between science and alchemy, right? Science isn't here to set a value and tell you have to arrive at a destination. Theoretically, science is to say, well, let's take the value system we have and examine the world and see what facts we can discover. Alchemy is a specific process to create something at the end of it. And that's the difference. A progressive education is trying to create a certain kind of world.
And in the scientific worldview, propositions are revisible, at least in principle. Like you'll change your mind based upon the evidence. With any ideology, by definition, that's not the case. And one of the things we see now is these institutions are becoming ideology mills, where the goal is not to help people find truth, but to replicate the moral orthodoxy, to replicate whatever the dominant ideology is. And now it's critical social justice or wokeism, or Wesleyan calls it the successor ideology. Majid Nawaz calls it regressive leftism. Whatever you want to call it, it's the same suite of propositions. Broadly, we can just use the term as a placeholder called woke.
Yeah. And it's totally fair to call it that. And everyone recognizes it when they say it, because they've all got the same, like you say, a suite of propositions, the same issues that they go along. But I think that the thing that most concerns me is essentially when you start drilling down to all of this, what it comes to is the desire for revolution in the people who are indoctrinating the students. Yeah. That's the problem. And Jordan Peterson called this years ago, but it was really difficult for people to really understand what he means. But I think actually now we're starting to get real, good, solid evidence, the actual numbers of how the conditions for revolution are actually fermenting in the minds of the young people who won't even understand why a revolution would be a bad thing.
That's why they need to defund the police, because the police are the individuals, the group that stands in between what they consider to be the capitalist machine. Yeah. And if you take away the police, then you can have whole-scale destruction of larger institutions, banking, small business,
the status quo can be overthrown. The police are the enforcers of the status quo, theoretically. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But before we go on, though, if you want to support us, go over to lotus.com. Of course, we're demonetized on YouTube, so thanks, YouTube, for being evil truth tellers. Go and support us, and go and check out this Victorian Manners and Etiquette series that Josh is doing, because he stumbled on a book of Victorian manners and etiquette. So he read it, did some studying, applied his psychological know-how to it, and it's not just what they did, it's why they did it, and it's absolutely fascinating. I'm not going to spoil it. Go and check it out. It's a really great series. Anyway, so I found this poll, and this really resonated with me, because it's basically a poll of how Americans see their own history. And man, it's not good news, actually. We laugh, but it's really not good news. And as you can see from this particular one, right? So prior to the arrival of European settlers, Native Americans and indigenous tribes lived in peace and harmony. And who agrees with that? Well, on a political level, the very liberal people, 71% agree with that, right? The generally liberal, 57%. On average, the moderate, 59%. But on the conservative side, it's less than half. Now, that concerns me, because that means that almost half of conservative people think, well, the Native Americans are just giving each other daisies and holding hands.
They've imbibed in the ideology because they themselves have gone to the same institutions.
Exactly. It's proliferating through the culture.
Right.
So these people should be a strong bulwark against this kind of nonsense, right? They should be like, no, we've got... The conservatives could be criticised, but I think maybe should be credited with having a more cynical view of human nature, right? As in, man is the more Hobbesian view. Man is actually kind of, if he's not raised well, he's a bad man, and he turns out to be a rough man. And so there's no reason to think that any other human being anywhere else in the world would not be the same way. However, the very liberal perspective, of course, takes the Rousseauian perspective, which is man is flawless and faultless in the state of nature.
And if you can change the institutions, then you can somehow change the outcome.
Yes.
So I think it's really worth lingering on one thing here.
Sure.
How did this madness come to be?
Well, that's the question.
Let's talk about that very quickly. And if I go on too long,
it's fine.
Let me know. So in the United States and the Anglosphere in general, teaching has become predicated upon, as crazy as this sounds, a single book, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
I have read this.
Yes, I have also read this. And James Lindsay, New Discourses, does some great stuff on that. But the shift is from, as we spoke about before, the telos, or the end of the institution being truth, to alleviating oppression.
Yes.
Once you start talking about the goal being alleviating oppression, your North Star of truth is not gone. So you'll forward any narratives that talk about that. Now, this is an example of a disparity. So let's take an example of some of those propositions that we talked about. Any disparity in outcome must be due to systems. That would be one. So African-American test scores on SATs, for example, that's Ibram X. Kendi's position. So this is forwarding a very specific narrative of indigenous people living in harmony with the land. Now, if you had a truth-seeking institution, then what you would do is you would say, okay, here's a view found, and you would put forth for the best proponent of, I don't know, this is such a deranged,
I don't even
utterly
know
false notion. I don't know who it would be. But
because I tell you, we'll go through some of the facts of the pre-colonial Americas at the end of this segment, and you'll see what's really interesting is where those facts come from.
Right.
Because it's not like right wing, evil right wingers who are like, no, here are the real. No. This is totally mainstream. Right. This is just a massively false narrative.
So if it were true, so that's that's.
Can you go back to the previous one? Sorry, John.
That's the problem with losing truth as the North Star. When you lose truth as the North Star, you lose a compass, you lose a kind of integrity. And so madness like this gets forwarded because it's fashionable.
Yes. And the problem as well is that this kind of madness is a delegitimizing factor to the United States as a country.
100%.
And that's really the thing but why would you do that? Like, the only reason you would do that is if you were looking for revolution, because this can only breed revolution.
Right, because you believe that the systems are inherently racist, patriarchal, and misogynist, and evil, and you have to overthrow them. And among the ways that
Exactly. You can't just expect people to live in what they perceive to be an unjust world, even if they can't actually see or identify any injustices around them.
Correct. And the litmus test for that is how many unarmed black men were killed by police in insert the year.
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times' one from 2019 or 2016. It was where it was
under 20. It's between.
It's literally double digits.
But even some of those are like, I just wrote the afterword to Matt Thornton's The Gift of Violence. He talks about this. Some of those are like man attacks a police officer with a toaster, but they don't consider it a toaster. So that goes into the unarmed.
Trying to take the police officer's weapon. Well, you are unarmed.
Yes, correct. So those
but there's a justified reason to do that.
Right. So those things. So one of the things. So I asked my neighbor that. Oh, actually, you said at my house. The woman. I won't say which side. I asked my neighbor that, and she said. I said, how many unarmed black men were killed by the police in 2019? She said 22,500.
Yeah. There was. I actually don't have it for this one, but in previous podcasts we've covered it, where literally the very liberal people will think over 10,000.
Right.
And it's like, wow.
Okay. So you can kind of understand if you think that there's a massacre of black people by police, like you can kind of be like, oh my God, like holy moly, we have to do something about this. But that's because those beliefs themselves aren't tethered to reality, because there's been there's been nothing on the other side.
Yeah.
Like the Martin Lewis's 1999, The Green Delusion. There's nothing showing what.
And this comes down to Frederick Hayek's. Again, I keep bringing up, but it's the most salient observation about propaganda and totalitarianism. And it's literally, he's like, look, we in a democratic society, because I mean, he's living in England at the time. He's like, look, there's propaganda everywhere, but it's pulling in all different directions. You get to hear opposite views, and so you get to weigh up the information they're giving you, and you realize that there's probably truth in both positions. So you're not radicalized in a certain direction. The problem with totalitarian societies is that the narratives, the propaganda, all goes in one direction, and so you don't know that there is not actually a disagreement.
Yeah, and
that's what we're seeing here.
The consequence of not of a lack is diversity. The consequence of a lack of intellectual diversity is that people become more confident that the beliefs they have are true because they're never introduced to other beliefs.
Absolutely.
So I've probably asked, I go around the world and I speak to people. When I speak to colleges, I always ask, how many gender studies people here?
Yeah.
And I invariably get people who raise their hand. How many people have read Martha Nussbaum's critique of Judith Butler? Not a single person. So in other words, Martha Nussbaum is a famous philosopher. Judith Butler is a famous gender theorist. And so you can't say, oh, well, she's not this is a man, or you can't.
No, it's two women having a discussion about feminism.
So I think this is such an alien notion, but it's so important for everybody listening to understand this. The point is to replicate the ideology. And in order to replicate the ideology, you can't have anything that contradicts that comes in.
And the trick they use isn't to lie either. They'll say things that are true, but what they'll do is omit things that are also true.
Right.
That show that it's not a black and white issue. It's actually much more nuanced and much more complicated. And this is deliberately done. It's a filtering mechanism. It's literally just filtering out things until you get the very narrow but very strong beam of ideology.
Correct.
That is put into people's minds.
Right.
And so, yeah, this is why, like, literally just Americans are just totally ill-informed about the very foundational nature of their own country. Like, if we go to the next one, right, this is based on race, right? So 45% of white people agree that they lived in peace and harmony. Okay, fine, half of those are going to be liberals, fair enough, and we know a lot of conservatives do, but that's better. But 75% of black people in America are convinced that the Native Americans just sat around, hugging each other, kissing each other on the cheek. It's just mental. It's absolutely mental, right? We go to education level. Now, this I found interesting, right? If you go to the next one, high school or equivalent, 66% thought that. Some college or associate's degree, 68% thought that. But bachelor's and graduate or professional degree, only 50%. So those people who are actually very well educated are like, well, no, the history doesn't show that. Those people who are educated but not overly educated have been given half of the information that they need.
Okay,
a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
This, if we get more granular on this, I think one of the reasons for this is exactly because you get a larger dosage of this in what do you call primary school here, K through 12?
Primary school.
Yeah, primary school. So you get a larger dosage of this in primary school.
Well, secondary school.
As a quick anecdotal example, my daughter was learning about gentrification in school, and they weren't teaching the other side of gentrification. They were only teaching that gentrification was a bad thing.
Yeah. And so this, as you can see, like, it's people who are not at the very upper echelons of the educational system, but also, how do you think this compares by age? If you go to the next one, John, 71% of Zoomers, people under 25, think the Native Americans just lived in the Garden of Eden. The millennials, 65%. Gen X, my generation, our generation, 57%. But at least 41% of the boomers, like 60% of the boomers, like, well, no. Right. And so, I mean, this to me just shows you the sort of capture of the educational system, right?
Yeah, and so the other thing that's really heartbreaking about this is you're credentialing people, you give them the imprimatur of some kind of legitimacy, and their degrees just don't mean what they think that they mean.
No.
And you're doing people a disservice.
The degree becomes like a signifier of ideological conformity.
Right.
It's like an ID card for the party,
so
right?
That's so good.
Like it's like in the Soviet Union, it doesn't become a measure of expertise. And like during Brexit, right, there was an interview with a chap called Michael Gove, who was a conservative politician, quote unquote, and he was on this like an interview show, and the person who's obviously very pro-Remain was like, well, all of the experts say, and Michael Gove was like, well, I think people have had enough of experts, and everyone was like, oh, you can't say that, and everyone laughed at him, and it's like, no, we have had enough of experts. Because like you say, your expertise is not the expertise you think it is.
Right.
There are things outside of your expertise that you've not deliberately omitted, but you're blind to.
So here's the problem. So we don't trust, at least in the United States, we don't trust our institutions.
No,
we don't trust the media.
Anyway.
They have lied to us about
The
Hunter Biden laptop. We don't trust our academies. But the fact of the matter is we need there is something legitimate called expertise, but
Yep.
we don't trust that the people who are credentialed have that expertise.
A lot of the time they don't.
So then we're in some kind of a soup or an epistemic chowder where we don't know what to pick out. We don't know how to... And the consequence in aggregate of that is nobody trusts our institution. There's a legitimacy crisis.
But also, any of the people in this institution, you can't be sure that they weren't in some way a beneficiary of an affirmative action program.
That's the
you
other
can't be
problem.
sure that. I mean, there have been since the days of Thomas Sowell. But as we were talking about in the cafe earlier, we know that there are people who rig the results based on race. We know that this happens. And so no one's that undermines literally everyone's qualifications.
So that's an equity-based solution.
Yes.
So an equity-based solution is trying to fix things on the back end, as opposed to what I'm for, and my guess is what you're for, is an equality-based solution, is to give everyone, for example, access to a public education of the first rate. Instead of trying to say, oh, well, we need what Heather McDonald calls proportional representation from the Manhattan Institute. We need African Americans, blacks are a certain percentage of the population in the UK. Say, I don't know, what is it, 8? 4?
For blacks, 3%.
I have no idea. 3. Okay,
3%.
so that 3% should be proportionally represented across the board.
See, I'm actually a bit more meritocratic about it, to be honest. I'm actually not very bothered about the amount of representation. For me, it's the process. Right?
No, that's what I'm saying. So that's a non-equity based solution.
Yeah.
So an equity-based solution is that you would say we need proportional representation, and thus we need to jerry-rig the system to achieve that.
They need to literally just be picked,
correct,
chosen, rather than
even if they're not qualified.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the consequence of that in aggregate is then we have what Habermas calls a legitimation crisis. So we just have a crisis of legitimacy because we don't know if the people flying the planes are operating on us or what have you.
That's where it goes, isn't it? Because, okay, it begins in a crisis of legitimacy, but the system can probably endure, a certain percentage of illegitimacy, but then you start getting just failing services. Things just stop working because the people who man them actually are not qualified to do what they're supposed to do. And when that starts getting to, say, airplanes or trains or whatever, and things start coming off the rails, falling out of the sky, that's when we're really going to learn the hard lesson of why these standards were important.
And frankly, I don't even know if we'll learn, because the consequence of this should not, if you point this out, the consequence should not be you're a bigot. The consequence of this,
and that's the smallest consequence. It could be you're fired, you're ostracized from society. But anyway, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, just if like an equity-based solution, I think this is so important, is, for example, if women have been underrepresented on boards, you say, okay, so women have been underrepresented on boards, so now we're going to have proportional representation of 50%. Well, then you won't trust that the women who are on the boards, so you won't trust the institution.
But moreover, you won't trust the men either, right? Because...
Explain why.
Because if you think like Wolf of Wall Street stuff, right? Yeah. The steely-eyed Machiavellian who gets to the sort of top of a corporate boardroom, right? Those sort of people are probably going to be selected against. It's going to be compliant, ideological, soft. The men who otherwise would have lost in a ruthless dog-eat-dog world are like, no, I agree with feminism. I agree. Yeah, but you're also not very competent, which is why you're not the ruthless capitalist who's out competing. So even the men who are there are obviously weak and compliant with this system, which is why they comply with it, which is why they ended up being the other 50%.
Can I swear on your show?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, there's something called the sneaky F.
Yes, Gad Thad's.
Formulation. He might have popularized it, but it preceded him. But the idea is that in among primates, it's hard to say this without. But I
think everyone knows where you're going.
So we're gonna that's it.
But that's the point, isn't it? So it doesn't just delegitimize the people who are being selected for; it also delegitimizes those people who have been selected against. And so it's the whole system, like you say, the crisis of legitimacy, and also the people at the top are just not going to be competent.
Yeah.
You're not going to have the steely-eyed realist who's like, no, we just have to make cuts here and here. You're going to get the weak, no backbone, fawning simp who's going to be like, well, I don't know, let's just hope something, no, you need to make a hard decision now, and you don't have the balls to do it.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is terrible, right? And just, so let's just quickly tell you what the truth of this is. Let's go to noted radical racist blog, Scientific American, who said, quote, contra leftist anthropologists who celebrate the noble savage Quantitative body counts, such as the proportion of prehistoric skeletons with axe marks and embedded arrowheads, or the proportion of men in a contemporary foraging tribe who die at the hands of other men, suggest that pre-state societies were far more violent than our own. How could Scientific American print this? Get a note.
The date.
Yes.
Yeah.
The date. Yes. No, in 2010, when the telos of Scientific American was truth rather than progress, right? If we go to the next one, a noted far-right blog, Wikipedia, can tell us all about the Incan Empire, how they conquered all of their neighbors through savage warfare. We can also go to the Aztecs, again, noted far-right blog, Wikipedia. I haven't got this one on there. But the Aztec flower wars were literally ritual wars they fought every year to capture people to sacrifice to make sure that the sun would rise the next day. That's literally what they did. But you might be like, yeah, but that's just South America. For some reason, they're different. What about those in North America? Sorry, these are the flower wars, as you can see. Again, just far-right blog. Just terrible.
Yeah, so can I linger on this for a second?
Yeah,
so
sure.
When we did our event at Portland State, one of the things that we did is we looked at a progressive style guide.
Oh, yes.
And they wouldn't term, it was disallowed
Yeah.
to term this witchcraft or sorcery or
Really?
what was what was the other word they use, folklore or what have you. And so that's what Dawkins and others and Jerry Coyne are fighting against with the Maori. They want kind of Maori ways of knowing, as if these are equivalent to science.
Well, there's a long discussion to be had there, but we won't have it now. But you can see the point. They had a proud warrior tradition, and you can only have a proud warrior tradition if you engage in war, and they engaged in war all the time because it was an empire. Empires are conquered; they aren't just given. Anyway, you might be like, okay, but that's the Central Americans. They are for some reason uniquely barbarous. The North Americans aren't like that, are they? No, they are actually. I mean, this comes from Canada.ca. Oh, the Canadian government. This is their little website talking about the history of military affairs in North America, and these people used to just wage war all the time. War played a multifaceted role and was waged for many different reasons. Some conflicts were waged for economic and political goals, such as gaining access to resource or territory, exacting tribute from another nation, or controlling trade routes. Wow, it's really, because that's weird, because that's like every other place on Earth. Literally every other place on Earth.
And just a data point in case people question you or question me and want to look for themselves. If the first slide that he put up showed a link to Steven Pinker, I assume it was Steven Pinker's Better Angels, where he documents this in detail.
Yes.
So society, the moral arc has been bending towards justice, and society is becoming more peaceful and less warlike.
I mean, like, Hobbes is not wrong that when men don't have a power to overawe them all, there's a lot more violence.
That's right.
I'm much more on the Hobbesian side of that. Yeah, nasty, brutish, short. Yeah, there's no question of it, right? And the Native Americans actually showed this, and like the Scientific American article pointed out, we have the numbers actually, and that's the point. That's why we institute governments among men to maintain the peace. That's why we do it.
Lying, in spite of what the postmodernists would say, lying about something doesn't change it.
No.
And there's Orwell again. He who controls the present controls the past. Yeah,
it's all true.
Right.
It's all absolutely true. The final thing, it's just the thing that I want to tack on at the end of this, not strictly related, but if you can click on it. This is a poll in the UK. It's not just America where people are totally out of touch. You can just bring this up, right? This is and we've done these before for America, because, I mean, Americans believe that like 30% of the country is transgender and stuff like this, and it's just like, okay, that's wild. We've got the same problem in Britain, because, of course, the media is constantly misrepresenting reality, right? I mean, in Britain, they think 5% of people are transgender.
I'm gonna pick a bone with this. I don't see the citation here, but according to Jason D. Hill, the philosopher, and it's been Abigail Schreier, Deborah So, and others, the reality of trans people is 0.06. That's before the contagion.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I have a little bone to pick, but I agree with the sentiment of this.
To be honest with you, I think it's probably lower than that.
Than 0.06?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I just don't see...
Now there are entire counties, literally counties and school districts in which 15 to 20% of people are...
identifying as.
Exactly,
because it's cool and fashionable, and they know they'll get special treatment.
So let's just... Very brief rabbit hole. Once you identify as that when you go to seek help, you have gender affirming, not questioning, but affirming. So we affirm that, and the next natural consequence is chest binding.
Yeah, we've got all of this in Britain.
Okay.
The Tavistock Centre.
So
it's been a long
that's
thing.
largely an American export, largely.
Completely. completely. And it's obvious nonsense. Children shouldn't be encouraged to do this. They shouldn't be encouraged to make any kind of major decision for themselves.
Not only they shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, it should be forbidden, obviously.
Right.
But like, I tell you, as a parent, as you might, I've just come to the conclusion that children just need less freedom.
Yeah.
Honestly, they don't need freedom. They need proper structure and order and rules they'll understand. Predictability is what children need. They need to know that tomorrow the sun's going to rise, the rules will be as they are, and they have got a space to move within between certain boundaries, and that's what makes them secure and happy.
And they need the tools to live better lives.
Yep.
And they need to be told that, because without going down the trans rabbit hole too much, that most of these kids are gay. Most of these kids are autistic.
Sure.
You know, I have two gay kids myself. Yep. Two of two. And so you're fine just the way you are.
Yeah.
You don't need to undergo a surgical procedure. If you're a young man, if your kid likes other young men, or likes to play with dolls or wear dresses, he's fine. You can love him just the way he is. That does not in any way mean that there should be some kind of what Abigail Shrier calls irreversible damage.
And what's important as well is that a lot of people change, right? There are as many ex-gays as there are gays.
Yeah, over
right?
90% of kids grow out of this after puberty.
Exactly. So,
and or if not, they don't want surgery, but they're autogonophilic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is not like you at 17 you thought you were gay, right? You're gay forever and you can't change. No, people change all the time, and it'd be better for them to go on their own journey.
This is one of the largest scandals that we face right now.
I tell you, this is going to age like trepanation and lobotomies.
Right.
Right. This is going to be in 100 years' time. They'll be like, I can't believe they used to chop off people.
Yeah, I can't believe they drilled skull
Exactly.
holes in people's skulls. Yeah,
It's going to be like, this was wild, and it absolutely is.
Yep.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Brokenomics series, this episode on the price of tomorrow with Jeff Booth. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com. On Getter. Thank you and goodbye.